There's a few selected quotations in our bulletin this morning from a small paperback book titled Humility by Andrew Murray. I was given a copy of that book by Ronnie Hines some time ago, and I was recently gifted another copy of it by somebody else, and it's such a good little book, I'm keeping both copies. I'm not re-gifting it. If you can find that little paperback, get your hands on it. It'll only cost you $4 or $5. It's worth much more than that. But in our bulletin this morning, I made a note in there about those quotations from that book that Mr. Murray helps us see what we just sang together in that song. The surest sign of God's presence in one's life is the absence of oneself. And that's what we just sang together. So thank you, Bryce, for leading us, and thank you for joining in the singing. Open your Bibles, if you would, to 2 Kings chapter 6. 2 Kings chapter 6. In 1966, in December, Walt Disney died at the age of 65. But before his death, several years before his death, he purchased some property outside Orlando, Florida, to build the theme park that we now know as Walt Disney World. But Walt Disney World did not open its gates until October 1st, 1971, almost 5 years after Walt Disney had passed. But when the time came for the park to open, and incidentally, this is a picture of opening day and every single employee at the Magic Kingdom on October 1st, 1971. When the park opened that day at the dedication ceremony for this new park, someone leaned over and spoke to Walt's widow and said to her, "Isn't it a shame that Walt didn't live to see this?" To which Miss Disney replied, "Oh, but he did see it, and that's why it's here." Now, you might be thinking, okay, yeah, he saw it because he had this park in California that he built in 1955, and so he's already done this once before, and that's true enough. But the idea that Walt's widow expressed is that Walt had a vision. When he went to this property in Orlando, this swampland property, and he bought that property, this is what he had in mind. He had a vision for what he wanted on that property. He could see it in his mind's eye, and he knew what he wanted to be there. He knew that he could take this swampland and turn it into the most magical place on earth. I want to think with you this morning about being able to see the invisible. Because one of the challenges that we face as God's people living in the world is to do this very thing. To be able to see that which is unseen. To see more than just with the eyes of our body, but to be able to see things with the eyes of our mind. We have to learn to see things as God sees them. Not content only to look at things through our human limitations. And the Bible expression for this, which we will see later in our lesson, the Bible expression for this is walking by faith and not by sight. The Apostle Paul says that in 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 7. And we'll make our way to 2 Corinthians 4 and 5 a little bit later. But I want to start right here by giving you an example of this in 2 Kings chapter 6. This is a fascinating story. The Syrian nation is at war with the Israelites. And the king of Syria, also called the Arameans, maybe your translation calls them the Arameans, but the king of Syria is thinking about strategy and battle plans and how he can best attack the Israelites. But no matter what the king of Syria does, the Israelites always seem to be 2 steps ahead of him. All of his plans are frustrated. Everything that he attempts to do, it never works. And he is confounded by this. He cannot figure out why it is that Israel is always ahead of him. And he gets angry and he begins to believe that there is a traitor among his armies. There must be an insider who is spilling our secrets to the Israelites. But the king of Syria has servants who come to him in verse 12, and they say, "No, my lord, there's no traitor. You see, Israel has a prophet named Elisha, and he knows the things that you dream in your bedroom." The Israelites have this man of God who knows your secrets. He knows the things that you are talking about with your military fighters. He knows the things that you are thinking about and strategizing. He is the one that's causing this problem for you. And so the Syrian king at night sends a force of armies and chariots to the city where Elisha was, and he surrounded the entire city. And in chapter 6, Elisha had a servant who rose early in the morning, I'm sure, to take out his golden retriever and let him go potty. And when he went outside, he saw thousands and thousands of Syrian soldiers gathered around the city. And he panics. And he comes back to Elisha, his master, and he says, "Lord, what are we going to do?" If you look in chapter 6 and verse 15, when the servant of the man of God, that's Elisha, had risen early and gone out, behold, an army with horses and chariots was circling the city. And his servant said to him, "Alas, master, what shall we do?" So he answered, "Do not fear, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them." This confident statement from Elisha surely made no sense to the servant. "What do you mean that there's more of us than there are of them? Elisha, it's just me and you here. There's just 2 of us. What do you mean that there's more of us? There's thousands of Syrians out there. What are you talking about?" And so Elisha in verse 17, he prayed and said, "O Lord, I pray, open his eyes that he may see." And the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was filled with horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. When the servant's eyes are opened, he was finally able to see what Elisha could see. Elisha knew that they had helpers all around them, that God's army was with them. But the servant didn't have eyes to see these transcendent realities. And beloved, we struggle with that too, don't we? We struggle to see things in the way that God sees things. And I understand that there is a sense in which we will never see things the way God does because He's God and we're not. God understands things that we don't. He is infinitely wise and we are not. And so yes, we do have limitations. But really what I'm saying to us this morning is we have to be able to see the spiritual things that God wants us to see. To not limit our vision to earthly, temporal things, but to know about the spiritual realities that exist outside of us. We need to have a consciousness of those things. We need to have that vision, the vision that God has. You know, you click and you think it scrolls and it doesn't. That's my fault. All right. God sees everything. There's nothing that God is not aware of. God sees everything there is to see on the earth. Do you remember what Hagar said of him in Genesis 16 and verse 13? She said to him, "Truly you are the God who sees." God sees everything that happens on the earth. You think about a passage like Matthew 10 and verse 29 that says, "No sparrow can fall to the ground without God's notice." Or Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 13 says, "There is no creature hidden from His sight." but all things are open and laid bare before him. Everything that happens on the earth, God sees it and he knows about it. Psalm 33, verses 13 and 14. The Lord looks from heaven. He sees all the sons of men. From his dwelling place, he looks out on all the inhabitants of the earth. And God surveys this creation that he made, and he knows every single person. He knows every single thing that happens. God sees not just the things that happen on the earth, not only the people and the activities, but God is able to see into the hearts of men and women. In 1 Samuel chapter 16 and verse 7, we talked about this in our Bible class this morning. Samuel told the people, do not look at the appearance or the stature of a man. God sees not as man sees. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. God knows what's inside of us. He knows who we are. He knows our character. He knows what we think and what we feel. He knows who we truly are. In 1 Kings chapter 8 and verse 39, Solomon in his prayer regarding the temple said to the Lord, then hear in heaven your dwelling place, and forgive and act and render to each according to all his ways, whose heart you know, for you alone know the hearts of all the sons of men. You know, it's possible for you and I to peek into the heart of another person. We're able to get a glimpse into the heart, into the true character of a person. But we have a couple of limitations that God doesn't have when it comes to knowing someone's heart. First of all, it takes us a really long time to be able to evaluate the heart of another person. I feel like I have a pretty good read on Stacy's heart. But I have been married to her for almost 16 years. It's taken me a long time to know her heart. I didn't know her heart the way that I do now 16 years ago. And so we have that limitation of time. God doesn't have that. God can look at me instantly and know what's inside my heart. But there's another limitation that we have that God doesn't have. And that is, we don't always fully know the heart of another person. I know this has happened to you because this has happened to me as well. I think this is common experience. There's someone, maybe in a church, maybe in the community, maybe a coworker, but someone that you've known for years and years, and you feel like you know what's in his heart, and then he goes and he commits some heinous sin, and you say, oh my stars, I can't believe that. How could that guy be capable of doing something so evil? Has that ever happened to you? Have you ever experienced that before? I thought I knew that guy. I thought I knew him. How could he do that? You see, we never know the full picture, do we? But God does. God doesn't have those limitations. God sees everything. He sees everything that happens on the earth. He sees everything in the heart of men. He knows what's on the inside. But God also sees the whole picture. He knows everything there is to know. He sees the end from the beginning. In Isaiah chapter 46 and verse 10, Isaiah says, remember the former things long past, for I am God and there is no other. I am God, there is no one like me, who declares the end from the beginning. And from ancient times, things which have not yet been done. God knows the future before it happens. He knows the end of the book without reading the book. You know, you hear people talk about that sometimes, and they say, oh, I just got a new book. I'm going to read the last 3 chapters, and then I'll have it all figured out. No, it doesn't work like that. You can't grab a book and read the last 3 chapters and know what happened in the first 17. But God can. He knows the end from the beginning. Here's another common experience that you've had. Maybe you've had this experience recently. You ever been driving on the interstate, and up ahead you see brake lights? And so you start to tap on your brakes, and then you hit them a little bit harder, And then you come to a complete stop. And you're at a standstill on the interstate and there's nowhere to go. Both lanes of traffic, congested, put the car in park, you're not going anywhere. Something up ahead has happened and it's bad. Well, in that moment, what do you start doing? Well, if you're like me, you maybe kind of turn your wheel and try to go over into the shoulder a little bit, stick your head out the window, but you know what? The problem is I can't see 7 miles. I don't know what's happening. I'm sitting in my car and I have a very limited field of vision. All I know is I'm stuck right here and there's nothing I can do about it. I can't see what's happening up ahead. I have no idea. But while I've got my window down and I've been peering outside trying to look up ahead, I start hearing the sound of a helicopter approaching. Now that man up in the helicopter, that woman flying the helicopter, they have a vantage point that I don't have. And they can see the whole thing. They see all that traffic backed up for miles and miles. But you know what else they see? They see what's causing the congestion in the first place. And so maybe that's a medical helicopter that's coming to get someone out and rescue them after a very serious car accident. But that person in the helicopter, they see the whole picture. You see where I'm going with that? You know, sometimes in life we get stuck. And just like being stuck in traffic, we feel like there's nowhere for us to go. We can't move forward, we can't move backward, we can't go left or right. We can't make sense of what's going on in life. But God's up there in that helicopter. And He's got a vantage point that we don't have. And He sees everything that we can't see. And He is able to make sense of the things that don't make sense to me. He sees the end from the beginning. Well, if only I could see as God does. If only I could see from God's perspective. Well, the apostle has some things to say about that. Let's go to 2 Corinthians chapter 4. 2 Corinthians chapter 4. I want to focus on verse 18. 2 Corinthians 4 and verse 18, where Paul says, "While we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen." Don't get caught up looking at the things that you can see. Rather, focus your eyes on the things that you can't see. Now, we understand that Paul is speaking in a metaphorical kind of a way. I can't use my physical eyes to see something that I can't see with my eyes. Paul's talking about, though, a spiritual kind of a vision. A vision that says there are unseen realities out there. And those are the things that Christians need to be able to see. We need to be able to see these things because the things that we can see, the visible things of this earth, are depressing. But the invisible things are encouraging. Look with me at verse 16 of chapter 4. "Therefore we do not lose heart. Though our outer man is decaying, our inner man is being renewed day by day." The outer man, the body, the visible things are depressing. But the invisible things, the inner man, our spirit, that is encouraging. We do not lose heart, he says. Don't become discouraged. Yes, the outer man is decaying, but the spirit within you is being renewed and growing stronger day by day. Every single thing that you can see with your eyes will one day be gone. It won't last. Our cars break down. Our roof needs replacing. Our hearing gets worse. Our vision dims. Our hair falls out. Pets die. People get sick. Everything that we see on the earth decays and it goes away, and it dies. But even though our outer man is decaying, the inner man grows stronger. We see this especially true among older Christians, don't we? You know, as older Christians are dealing with health struggles and chronic pain and the frailties that come along with age, you talk to them about that and you say, "Sister, how are you feeling?" And you know how she's feeling. She's in pain, she's hurting, she's sick. You know how that brother is feeling because he's been fighting the Lord's battles for a long time. He is a soldier in the Lord's army, and he has been for many, many years. You know how he's feeling physically. But when you talk to them about eternity, when you talk to them about heaven and going to be with the Lord, there's an excitement in their voice. And they say, "I'm ready. This is what I've been working for my entire life. I'm ready to go and be with Jesus. I am ready for heaven. And so I am always of good courage." That's the expression Paul used in chapter 5 and verse 6. He said, "I'm always of good courage." Everything we can see is depressing. But when we see the invisible, when we see the unseen, when we think about heaven, when we think about eternity with Jesus, when we think about eternity with all of God's redeemed, when we can see that in our mind, we do not lose heart. Paul tells us in verse 17, though, that the visible, the earthly, brings suffering, while the invisible brings glory. Verse 17 of chapter 4, he says, "For our momentary light affliction is producing for us an eternal weight of glory far beyond all comparison." As a Christian, you will make choices in your life that will bring you difficulty and suffering. But those choices that you make are choices that will be rewarded. They are choices that will be blessed, either on earth or in heaven. And especially in heaven. Put your marker here. And then turn over with me to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11. We're going to turn to this chapter at the end of the lesson as well. But in Hebrews 11 and verse 27, speaking of Moses, Moses left the comforts of Egypt to join with the Hebrew people and go into the barren wilderness. Well, why did he do that? Well, verse 27 tells us, "By faith Moses left Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is unseen." Moses saw him who was unseen. He saw God. Now, there is a very real sense in which Moses would come to see God. But even while in Egypt, Moses knew who the God of the Hebrews was. He knew who his people were, and he knew that it was better to go into the wilderness with the people of God and with no earthly riches than to stay in Egypt and enjoy all those comforts and all the privileges that he had there. That was a choice that Moses made that for a time brought temporal suffering. But in the end, because he saw the God who was unseen, it brought glory. Let's go to Romans chapter 8. Romans 8. Paul gives us these two ideas, suffering and glory, once again. In this majestic chapter, Paul says in Romans 8 and verse 18, that I consider the sufferings of this present time, that they are not worthy to be compared with the glory that is to be revealed to us. The sufferings that we experience in life, and Paul's sufferings were many, he says it's not even remotely proper to compare those sufferings to the glory that God has in store for us. If you go back to 2 Corinthians 4, I want you to look at this expression that Paul uses. Back to 2 Corinthians 4, again, verse 17. He says, our momentary and light affliction. You know, if I live to be 100 years old and I suffer throughout the duration of all of that time on the earth, suffering for 100 years, that sounds pretty miserable, doesn't it? Yeah, it does, if I'm only looking at the visible. But in light of eternity, what's 100 years? And so in that sense, Paul can say, our suffering is momentary, and it's really nothing. It's light. Light affliction. Paul, you were shipwrecked. You were beaten with rods. You were put into prison. People wanted to kill you. How can you say that that's light suffering? Because it doesn't last. And even if that suffering ended in Paul's death, Paul knows immediately what awaits him. What awaits him is the eternity that he has been working so hard to receive. Our suffering is nothing in comparison to eternity. And so the visible brings suffering, but the invisible points us to glory. And now in verse 18, Paul says that the visible is empty, but the invisible is fulfilling. So building off of what he said in verse 18, that we're not looking at the things we can see, but now we're looking at the things we can't. Building on verse 18, let's just roll right into chapter 5, and we'll see this point. He says, for we know that if the earthly tent, which is our house, is torn down, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For indeed in this house we groan, longing to be clothed with our dwelling from heaven. The visible is empty, the invisible is fulfilling. He uses two terms in verse 1. He uses this phrase, the earthly tent, and he uses this word, our house. The earthly tent and the house. He's talking about our bodies. The body that, as we've already seen, is decaying. Chapter 4 and verse 16. The body that's becoming weaker and weaker over time. The body that is moving towards death. That's our tent. That's our earthly house. But that's contrasted to another word that he uses in chapter 5 and verse 1. He says, if the earthly house is torn down, we have a building not made with hands. A building that is from God. A building whose architect and whose builder is God. A building, something, not a tent that's temporary. Not a tent that can be blown over by strong winds, but a building, something that's permanent, something firmly established. He says in verse 2, in this house, in this tent, we groan because we are longing for the permanent structure that God has built for us in the heavens. And so what I take from this is that the physical things of the earth are not satisfying to us. They may bring us momentary satisfaction and joy, but they are not satisfying or fulfilling in the ultimate sense. The things of earth are not things that will truly fulfill our deepest longings. And when we try to satisfy our longings with temporal and earthly things, we will always come up empty. It's like trying to satiate our thirst with salt water. We think that it helps, but ultimately, it leaves us empty. And beloved, this is one of the things that should separate us as Christians from the rest of the world. The world looks at all of the things that are visible, and they limit their vision to that. The world only sees the bigger house, the newest car, the nicest clothes. because they're focused on the visible. And they think that those kinds of worldly riches will bring them some kind of satisfaction and fulfillment. But we know better than that, because God has warned us against that kind of thinking. And because we can see the invisible, we realize what Paul says in chapter 5 and verse 8 is true. He says, "We are of good courage, I say," chapter 5, verse 8, "and we prefer rather to be absent from our body and to be home with the Lord." It is better to be dead from the earth's perspective. It's better that I physically die, because that means I get to go and be with the Lord. As long as I am alive here on this earth, it means I am not with the Lord in eternity. And ultimately, isn't that where we want to be? So Paul helps us see that we should be courageous, because we know what God has in store for us. Something that is truly fulfilling in the greatest sense. We understand that God has prepared us for this. In chapter 5 and verse 5, he uses that language. Now he who prepared us for this. This is what God has been helping us see all along. He's been bringing us along little by little. He's been teaching us from the time that we came up out of the waters of baptism that eternity is yours, and I'm going to help you get there. That the things of the earth are not the things that we need to focus ourselves on anymore. That the things of the earth are fleeting and temporary, but rather, as Paul said in Colossians 3, we are to set our mind on things above, not on things that are on the earth. And God is preparing us for eternity with Him. And so in chapter 5 and verse 7, Paul says that we must walk by faith and not by sight. I told you we were going to go back to Hebrews chapter 11. So let's do that together. Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews 11. All these verses that we looked at are now scrolling up on the screen. And as I tell my children when they can't figure out how to do something, it's not the wand, it's the wizard. That was my fault, guys. Here we go. This is where I want to be. It scrolls when you click the button. Chapter 11, the book of Hebrews. I want to say something about Hebrews 11 and verse 1. I know that, this is a very common passage, and we talk about this a lot. And if somebody was to ask you, can you help me understand what faith is? Can you define faith for me? This is always the passage that we go to. And we look at Hebrews 11 and verse 1, and we say, see that right there? That's the definition of what faith is. I don't think that's right. Oh, I was waiting for audible gasps. Hebrews 11:1 is talking to us about a particular aspect of faith. And what it's talking to us about is what we've been studying together this morning. The ability to see the unseen. The ability to have trust and confidence in God even though I can't see what God is doing. But I don't think that's the only element of faith, and I don't think that's the only aspect for us to consider. But what I want to show you in Hebrews 11 is that all these characters that are listed, they have something in common. Despite the fact that some are men and some are women, and some lived at time periods that are separated by centuries, they have something in common. And what they have in common is what is said in verse 1, that these people acted out of trust in God even though they could not see what God was doing Or maybe they would not live to see with their own eyes what God was doing. So look with me as we think about some of these characters in chapter 11. Look at verse 7. Let's just pick out a few of these together. Chapter 11, verse 7. By faith Noah, being warned by God about things not yet seen. You see, doesn't that go back to verse 1? That faith is the conviction of things not seen. Noah has never seen a flood like what he is about to see. Nobody on the earth has ever seen what was soon to happen. And yet Noah obeyed God by building the ark, and you remember that story. Chapter 11 and verse 8. By faith Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place that he was to receive for an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. He couldn't see it. God called him and said, Abraham, start walking. And one of these days, I'll tell you to stop when you get there. He didn't know. He couldn't see it, as it were. Chapter 11 and verse 19, we're still talking about Abraham. And it says that Abraham considered that God is able to raise people from the dead, talking about when he was to sacrifice his son Isaac. Has Abraham ever seen God raise somebody from the dead? Nope. At least, not according to the Scripture. No, he's never seen that before. And yet he thought, maybe God can do that. He can see something he's never seen. Are you following me? You see, you look at these people listed in this chapter, and it is, here, David, again, I'm just all over your class. I'm sorry. These characters see what they could not otherwise see. Chapter 11, verse 22. By faith, Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the exodus of the sons of Israel and gave orders concerning his bones. Joseph dies. The exodus doesn't happen for 400 years. He didn't see it. There's no way he was going to live to see the Israelites leave the land of Egypt. But he said, hey, when the time comes, don't leave me here. Pick up my box of bones. Take me with you. I want to go to the promised land too. But he wasn't going to live to see that. We already mentioned Moses, verse 27, who made the choice to leave Egypt because he saw him who is unseen. You see, all these characters in this chapter, they all acted in faith, but they all could see what God was thinking. They could see what God was planning and what he was doing. And so they acted in faith because they were able to see something they could not see with their own eyes. So verse 13, all of these died in faith without receiving the promises, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance. Joseph welcomed the exodus from Egypt from a distance, a long distance, 4 centuries of a distance. He couldn't see it, not in his lifetime, but he did see it through the eyes of faith. Verse 16, all of these desire a better country, that is a heavenly country. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. You remember when Paul said that in 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 5, that he who has prepared us for this. God has prepared us for the things that he has prepared for us. And he did that to all of these of old as well. All right, now let's go back to 2 Corinthians 5 and we'll bring our sermon to a close. One more time, 2 Corinthians chapter 5. When you and I can see the invisible, Paul tells us in this context that it enables us to see the consequences of our own actions. So in chapter 5 and verse 9, he says, therefore we have as our ambition, whether we are at home or absent, to be pleasing to him. He's already used that language in verse 8. That if we are absent from the body, then that means we're at home with the Lord. And so it's our ambition, whether we're at home or absent, whether I'm alive or dead, I'm going to be pleasing to the Lord.
And I'm going to do that because in verse 10 he says, "For we will all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may be recompensed for his deeds in the body, according to what he has done, whether good or bad." My aim in life is to be pleasing to God. My aim in my death is to be pleasing to God and say, I lived a life that honored the Lord. That's what I want. And I can't wait for the day when I can be in eternity with Him, where I know that I will be pleasing to Him, doing His will forever and ever. So seeing the invisible helps us understand that there are consequences to our actions. I've never seen with my own eyes or experienced anything like what the judgment day will be, but I believe in the judgment day. And my ability and your ability to see the judgment day up in front of us is affecting the way that we live here. We're seeing the invisible. But when we see the invisible, Paul says this in verse 11, that it helps us to see the lost in the world around us. And so we know the fear of the Lord, and so we persuade men. Because we know that the judgment is coming, and we know that the world is filled with lost people who will stand before God in judgment, he says, we must persuade them to know Christ. We need to help them see the invisible as well. To help them see that there will be a judgment one day. And you will be eternally saved or eternally lost. And so we persuade them to make the choice to follow Jesus. So, how is my vision? And how is yours? Are we living in such a way so as to see the invisible? To see the realities that are out there? Not with our physical eyes, not with our earthly eyes, but through the eyes of faith, to know what God has said in His Word, to know the promises that He has given to us, the warnings that He has given to us, and do we believe them? Because if we do, then we're seeing the invisible as God wants us to see. If you're not a Christian, we want you to begin serving the Lord and walking by faith, realizing that all the things that the earth offers are not fulfilling in any ultimate sense, but that the Lord Jesus Himself offers true fulfillment. And He offers it in ways that we can't imagine until we completely give ourselves over to Him and to His service. Hope that appeals to you. If it does and you're ready to obey the gospel, come forward and have a seat now as we stand and sing together.